Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to another Dark and Darker video. It's me, Cranberry. How's it going? Hopefully you're doing well. Today we're not playing the game. I should mention that, obviously, if you clicked in the video, it's pretty obvious we're not playing the game today. We are doing a tier list of all of the characters in Dark and Darker. The last time I had done this was way back in like the first week of early access existing. It was a brand new game back then. A lot has changed since then. And I thought it would be fun to do a tier list before the next big wipe happens, because it should be bringing a lot of changes to the game. I wouldn't be surprised if things really got shaken up in the stat rework that's happening. There's going to be a whole big change to how agility and strength work. So that should be interesting. That should be exciting. It should be very cool. But I wanted just to kind of put my thoughts out there about the current balance of the game. Now, one thing I want to talk about real quick before we get into it too much is the methodology we're using here. Right, and the reason why I want to do this is because last time I did one of these tier list videos, not to be rude, but a lot of people skipped over the methodology that I was using to evaluate characters. And because of that, they left a lot of comments that, in my opinion, were very stupid. They didn't understand the criteria we were using to evaluate characters, and because of that, they left a lot of comments that ignored that criteria. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Now, there's an important difference, though, between the game right now and the game back then. Back then, gear, equipment, was a lot different. It was much more powerful in general, and because of that, certain characters benefited a lot more than other characters did from certain gear stat upgrades, right? For example, rogues were a character that was very much able to abuse flat damage modifiers on weapons, which makes sense if you think about it, right? If you have a character that can do 3 attacks in 1 second, and you give them plus 30 damage, you have increased their DPS by 90 per second, right? Versus, let's say, for example, a Barbarian who attacks very slowly. If you increase their base damage by 30, but they only attack once every second, you have only increased their DPS by 30 per second, right? That was an issue with gear way back then, and it still exists right now. However, just the general balance on gear modifiers is a lot different. It's a lot more balanced, generally speaking. So, because of that, the criteria we're using today is not really based on gear levels. There are definitely certain characters that are stronger at base gear than other characters, but generally speaking, the game is in a pretty good state of balance in regards to equipment, right? Rogues are not, running around with crazy high damage numbers. Wizard was another character that kind of benefited more from gear modifiers than other characters, and now it's, gear is more balanced. So we're not evaluating based on a certain level of gear. We're just evaluating in general, right? So let's get into it. Let's start talking about the characters here. Oh, I'm stupid. I should mention we're doing first. We're gonna rank based on solos, and then we're gonna rank based on trios. Now it's important to note that that duos do have a distinct meta from solos and trios. However, I have played very little duos. I do not have a good sense of the duos meta. I've played more solos than anything, but I've played enough trios for me to feel like I have at least a decent understanding of how the meta works there. But yeah, duos, I don't know. Duos is kind of the Wild West for me. So I don't have a great sense of how strong it is, so I don't feel comfortable making a tier list on that. I don't think I do a good job on that one. The other two I think I can hopefully do an okay job on. Now, let's start off with Druid. When it comes to solos, Druid doesn't exist, so it's the worst character in the game. But maybe one day it'll be the best, who knows? But for now, we'll just put it in the F tier here, because it doesn't exist, and I'm sad that it doesn't. But, one day for sure. The first real character that we'll talk about is Barbarian. We're putting it in B as a placeholder right now. It won't necessarily go there. Just for now, we'll put it in B tier. Let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses Barbarian has in solos, right? Barbarian benefits from having a very good stat spread. It has incredibly high strength, low agility, obviously, but incredibly high strength with access to burst movement via rage. It also has access to really good sustain with the combination of Blood Exchange and Achilles Strike. However, if you use Blood Exchange and Achilles Strike, you forego your burst movement and rage. So there's a very interesting dynamic there of which one is better. I actually don't know the answer right now. If it was me, I would lean more towards rage currently, because I very much value burst movement in the current solo meta, but I don't know. It's there's pros and cons to both build strategies. I think they're both in a pretty good place right now, balance wise. After the nerfs to Blood Exchange, I think it's fine. I don't think it's too powerful. It is pretty strong though. It is a lot of healing that you can get off of a one single Achilles strike. That's interesting. Beyond that, they have let's just say they have access to some pretty interesting weapons. Their one-handed move pool, or the one-handed pool of weapons, is Viking swords, horseman's axes, and hatchets, right? And I think we can all agree, generally speaking, these are all pretty bad weapons. Out of the one-handed swords, Viking swords, most people agree are the worst. They've been buffed significantly since they first were put into the game, but they're still pretty bad. However, Viking swords kick the absolute shit right now out of horseman's axes and hatchets, right? A Viking sword only has a -20 base movement speed penalty, whereas I believe hatchets are -25, and horseman axes are -30 to your base movement speed. As a one-handed weapon, that's atrocious. That is so bad comparatively. And they also just have terrible stats too on them. The Viking sword has pretty good damage numbers, although it has like a really slow attack and a weird wind-up on it too. But the horseman axe, while it might attack a little bit faster, outputs way less damage. I'm pretty confident in saying it's a better hitbox on it. I think generally speaking, it's a lot easier to land headshots with it. It feels like it has better reach, but I'm not 100% certain on that. But it's just the movement speed penalty and the lower damage on it are just atrocious right now. And then hatchets, while not as slow, also just a pretty bad weapon in general. So Vikings or Barbarians have weird one-handed options. When it comes to two-handed options, they have battle axes, one of the worst fucking two-handed weapons in the entire game. Felling axes, which are very high risk but high reward weapons, right? They have very low range, but if you connect with them, their follow-up attacks are incredibly fast. You can output incredible DPS with a felling axe, but they're unwieldy, and they, they can struggle sometimes. If you whiff a single attack during a fight, you might just die for it. And they're pretty high movement speed penalty on them too, right? They have, I believe, -40. I don't have a sheet here I'm reading from, so you have to forgive me if I don't know the exact numbers. But I believe it's -40 on both that and the battle axe. You have access to the Zweihander. I love the Zweihander. It's a miserable fucking weapon to use. One thing I should have mentioned actually at the start too, maybe I'll go back and edit it, I'll splice it in. But when we're talking about solos, we're talking specifically about the Goblin Caves, right? We're talking about like the meta. We're not talking about other maps. Obviously, the Zweihander is better on Ruins than it is on Goblin Caves because you have much more wide open areas that have bigger swings, right? But in the Goblin Caves, the Zweihander is a miserable fucking weapon to use because it's so easy to clank on things instead of actually getting your follow-up attacks. Because the arc is so wide and the damage is so fucking low. The alternate attack, the whoop-de-doop, miserable weapon attack as well to use. It's so fucking easy to clank on the ground with it. It's just not good. It's bad in every way basically, but it's really fun to use. But it's miserable. Okay, beyond that, you have Bardishes, which are not bad. I'm not a big Bardiche fan. They're a little unwieldy, but that second follow-up attack, the mouse 2, if you will, like the 1-2, is really good. It has nice reach, but it has a very fast follow-up attack. The Bardisha is pretty cool, but it's, again, super high negative move speed on it. You've got War Maul, which is kind of the meta for Barbarian right now, which is a pretty good solo weapon. If you're raging and you manage to connect with the War Maul, the slowdown they receive from the hit is usually slow enough to keep them pretty much in hit stun forever, basically, right? You should be able to stay on top of them and keep hitting them even if they're running away. Unless they're maybe like a sprinting fighter or like they're a really sneaky rogue or whatever, they might be able to get away, but most characters, if you get that first hit on them, you should be able to get follow-up hits pretty easily. And also it just does good damage, right? Again, same issue as Zweihander with the wide arcing swings. And I think it has a bigger sour spot than most weapons with the hilt, but I don't know the exact hurtbox and hitbox data on the hilt of the War Maul. But anyway, weird weapons, generally speaking, for Barbarian. That's the big thing I would say is holding Barbarian back, is access to, generally speaking, pretty stinky weapons, right? Other than that, they're a pretty strong character. I think overall, I'll put Barbarian in the A tier. I think this is where they belong. They are sort of like the gatekeeper to Goblin Caves, because a lot of characters, they really just can't deal with a Barbarian very well. They just can't do it. And because of that, they get kind of murdered. But Barbarians have some tough matchups too. One of which is so bad, it's I think the sole reason why it doesn't get to be an S tier. There is one matchup that they have is so bad, that's so common right now in Goblin Caves, that because of that, they just can't be an S tier, I think. And we'll talk about that when we get to it later. But for now, this is where the Barbarian goes in the A tier, pretty solidly. It's a good character in solos, but there are better choices. Now, you know what's weird is, did I move Ranger around? Because before I'm pretty sure this was alphabetical. Hold on, I want it to be alphabetical now. Anyway, up next is Bard. Bard is the, oh, you know what? I was messing around with him before I started recording the video. That's why. Okay, sorry. Anyway, Bard is up next. Bard is, if you ask me, the worst character in the game for solos right now. I'm sorry to say. It's not so bad that it belongs in the F tier, but it is, I think, without a doubt, currently in the game, the worst solos character, right? The reason for that is they've been nerfed quite a bit, and I don't dislike the nerfs to Bard. I think that the game should be balanced around trios. I think that's the important thing to balance around. But in balancing Bards for trios, they have crippled them severely for solos, right? The fact that they now are much more gear dependent, the fact that they now require, you know, investment in your knowledge stat in order to have, as, you know, all of the songs that you need. Because of that, Bards are a lot weaker, right? Before, as a Bard, you would just take double song memory, and you would just take 10 of your best songs, and you would go in, and you would just permanently keep yourself buffed up with all of your buffs. You juggle them as you were just walking around killing AI. And then if you saw a player, you were pretty strong. You were pretty strong, but because the buffs themselves have been reduced, and because the fact that, you know, your gear investment, you're now required to invest in gear in order to get the rest of your good songs, you now can't solely invest your gear in combat, right? So it's interesting. They're not worthless. I want to mention that here too, real quick. When we talk about, you know, the characters that are in S tier, Bards are not. I don't know the exact ratio, right? If we're talking about matchup spread, we're talking about, pretend this is like a fighting game. We're talking about matchup spread. I think the worst matchup in this game is probably, maybe it's like 65-35, right? I think, and that's not a terrible matchup. It's not good, obviously, but, you know, the disparity in power is not so crazy that Bards will never beat like a Barbarian in a fight, but it's tough out there. It's tough out there. Bards have to play it really well in order to win their fights. That being said, also, they have access to some okay weapons. Rapiers are pretty good. With the Rapier Mastery perk is pretty nice, honestly. They have access to that. They have access to Arming Swords and Falchions, which are both really good one-handed weapons, right? And, you know, that's about it. Their unique Bard armor is, it helps with that gear dependence, right? It helps for sure, but it still generally means that, you know, if, for example, if you're using a knowledge chest piece on your Bard, that means you're not using a padded tunic instead, right? Or if you're using a knowledge pair of legs, it means you're not using loose trousers instead, right? So there are issues with Bard. And they really suffer from by the way, important to note, the nerfs to some of their spells, to their songs, were huge, like gigantic, drastic cuts to what their original stats were, right? I think specifically the armor and magic resist one. What is it currently at now? Isn't it like 15%? Let me double check it actually real quick. Hold on, Google, help me out here. Bard, dark and darker. Hold on. What is their harmonic shield ability do now? Where are the spells? Spell list, please. Hold on. Harmonic shield. Oh my god. It used to be 50. It is now 15. That's a gigantic cut to what their stats used to be, right? It's kind of nutty. It is kind of insane how some of these abilities have been just kind of... gutted is the wrong word for it because they're still usable, but they're significantly nerfed, right? Tranquility was a big one too. Tranquility was a huge nerf to not so much to solo bards, but it hurt. The Tranquility nerf did hurt as well. I don't know. I think they belong here in C tier. And if you disagree with me, you're allowed to. But I think they're pretty clearly far. And you know, I also think it's okay for bards to be the worst solo character. It makes sense. They're supposed to be a support class. It's not that weird that a support class is the worst by itself, right? So, anyway, moving on to clerics. Clerics might be the most wrong opinion that I have on this list. Let's put them in B tier for now. This is a placeholder again. I'm not 100% decided on this, so I want to talk it through so I can come to a decision. Clerics are very interesting characters. They are very strong in trios, right? They're still meta-defining character in trios right now. They've been for forever, and they're never going to stop, right? But when it comes to solos, I've kind of underrated them a little bit, I think, generally. However, they've also had some nerfs recently, right? But they've also kind of had some buffs too, right? The change to resting to get your spells back is a pretty not bad buff for clerics overall. It does mean that you can't use because they took out the clarity potions. Those are gone, but the fact that you can sit to get your spells back so much faster is really interesting for clerics. It doesn't take that long to get your spells back now. But your lesser heal, which is one of your important spells as a solo cleric, only has 3 casts at a time, which is a huge issue. Actually not huge. It's a significant issue, but it's not huge, I guess. How do I say this exactly? Generally speaking, when you are a cleric and you are fighting someone, you are slow as shit. You are so slow, and you should probably never be able to disengage from an enemy and heal yourself with like a cure light wounds or whatever, right? It should be pretty much impossible to do that. However, you know, Dark and Darker is chaotic, right? You never know what's going to happen. Maybe an AI comes in and breaks you up, and you get a chance to disengage for a bit, and you can top back off, right? That is a very valuable thing that clerics have in their pocket. However, with the reduction to the amount of heals they have at any given time, that's an important nerf to them. I think the one thing that I really never gave credit to clerics for is the fact that both Smite and Judgment are really strong abilities. Plus 10 magic damage per hit is really good. Judgment's also just really good, especially in solos. More so in solos than trios, I think. Both of them more so in solos than trios. They're very strong abilities. And they have access to okay perks in general. But they kind of, I don't know, especially for solo combat, they're some of their perks are definitely wasted, right? There's like 2 or 3 good solo perks, and there's like 1 or 2 junk ones that you have to take basically because you have no more slots to use up, right? And in addition, one thing I want to talk about too, actually real quick, is spellless cleric. I've seen people talk about how some clerics just use Judgment and Divine Smite and forego spells. And if you have a pretty good gear set for this, you are incredibly terrifying. Right? That's important to note that is no fucking joke. That setup is incredibly strong. But you're slow. No matter how you do it, no matter how you make your cleric, you're gonna be slow as shit. If you go for like a heavy armor cleric, no matter what build you're doing besides that, like you could be doing, you know, spellless, with spells, whatever, you're going to be so fucking slow. And there are classes in this game that'll just run circles around you no matter what you're doing, and you just won't be able to hit them. And they'll just tear you to pieces, you know, death by 1,000 cuts. And there's kind of nothing you can do about it. So, I don't know. Clerics for me, I think B tier is the right spot for them right now in solos. I could be convinced that they're A tier. I could be convinced that they're C tier. But I think B tier is the right spot for them right now in the current meta. If they're again, as a lot of people have said, before me, speed is king in this game. Speed is the single most important thing in this game. And clerics don't have any speed. They have a lot of other really good stuff, but they are slow, and that will be their undoing. Anyway, up next. Oh, baby. We've got an interesting one. We've got fighters. Now, I wish I had fighters listed twice on this list, because I would like to do one fighter ranking for Slayer fighter and one fighter ranking for PDR fighter. Also, you know, tank fighter, armor fighter, or whatever you want to call it, because they're very unlike any other character in this game. These two build styles are very distinct from each other in how they play. Right? We mentioned before spellless cleric, right? And in the grand scheme of things, they don't play that much differently. They just don't have spells. That's the only real difference here between these two characters. Slayer fighter and PDR fighter, drastically different characters. I mean, at the end of the day, you're hitting people with swords. It's not that different. But to me, at least, I think Slayer fighter and PDR fighter are very different characters in how they play and how they perform, right? So just based purely on Slayer fighter, for me, I would put fighter in the S tier. Now, if they were separate characters, where would I rank PDR fighter? I don't know. It's genuinely a tough decision for me. I think PDR fighter should go either in S tier as well or A tier right now. They're both very strong builds. I think gun to my head, I would put PDR fighter in A build right now, or A tier right now. But I'm not sure. That one I don't feel too confident about. But either way, Slayer fighter is an S tier character right now, and we're gonna go on a long walk here to talk about this basically. But there's a very important reason why Slayer fighter has all of a sudden become one of the strongest characters in the game. Right now, way back when. Before the most recent wipe, at one point in time, Slayer fighter was very niche, because Slayer fighter used to have, and I should explain how Slayer fighter works in general, right? So Slayer fighter is a fighter build that dual wields. They use one main hand weapon and one offhand weapon, right? The reason why they do this is because they have a perk called Slayer, and when they do this, when they dual wield like so, they get a +5 flat damage boost to their attacks, right? The trade-off is that they are not allowed to wear armor. Fighters also have another perk called Dual Wield, which gives them, at this point, a +10% increase to their action speed. It used to be 15%, but it got nerfed recently. So, Slayer Fighter, when dual wielding, and when having the dual wield perk, would have a 10% increase to their attack speed, combined with a +5 flat damage boost. The only catch was that they could not wear metal armor anymore. So, chest plates, any metal helmets, gauntlets, and plate boots were now illegal, right? Here's the thing, though. That's not that big of a deal. That's not that huge of a nerf. The thing that was keeping Slayer Fighter held back was two very important things. One, their offhand weapons slowed them down, right? In the past, Slayer Fighters would have to use usually a Castilian dagger. Castilian daggers were a native fighter weapon, so they could use them without having to use weapon mastery. And it was one of the weapons that had the lowest movement speed penalty on it, right? When you dual wield, you get the movement speed penalty of both your weapons, right? So if you have a -20 arming sword and a -10 Castilian dagger in your offhand, you would get both of the penalties when you were holding both of them, right? What changed was that, you know, I think it was the beginning of this current wipe, but maybe it was sometime different. I don't remember exactly the time frame. But at some point, lanterns were changed to be classified as a offhand weapon, right? So what that meant was, as a Slayer fighter, you could use a sword in your primary hand and then a lantern in the offhand, and you would get the benefits of Slayer fighter and dual wield, right? Without the movement speed penalties, because at the time, lanterns had no move speed penalty on them, and they still currently, at the time of me recording this, have no move speed penalty on them. So now you are faster than you were before, and you still have the benefit of dual wielding, right? Very important to note there. Another important thing to note was that at the beginning of the game, up until very recently, a +5 damage increase was To be fair, not that significant of a damage boost, right? It was very easy, you know, maybe not very easy, but it was pretty easy on any character to get, you know, plus 20 to plus 30 flat damage increase on your build, right? Not impossible, but that's the higher end of what's reasonable. I think the numbers specifically were like the absolute maximum capacity was like 70 damage, but like that's like is insane RNG rolls, right? Realistically, a person could get about 20 to 30 bonus damage without too much trouble, right? Nowadays, though, that is a lot harder to do. As much harder to do right now in the current state of the game. So because of that, at the time of me recording this, a +5 flat damage increase is a very significant damage increase. That's a huge damage increase right now, basically, right? So Slayer fighters now have no offhand move speed penalty. They have what is considered a huge damage increase for free, and they're kind of terrorizing people a little bit. They're you know, in the grand scheme of things, they're not so powerful that the people are like, you know, at least from what I've seen, they're not you know, rioting in the streets about how Slayer fighters should be nerfed. But it's a very strong build. I mentioned before about the reason why Barbarian wasn't S tier was because of a certain character. It's because of Slayer fighters. Slayer fighters are too mobile, and they're just too high damage for Barbarians to deal with right now. It's just too much for them. The poor men can't handle it. It's just too much. They're very, very, very strong. To get more into the nitty gritty of it, you know, Slayer fighters have access to 2 very powerful weapons currently with arming swords and falchions. Another thing too to keep in mind, around the same time these gear changes happened, which made it so that way damage stacking was much harder to do. I think maybe it was a little bit afterwards technically, but both arming swords, I believe, and falchions got a pretty big base damage increase. You got the perfect storm for Slayer fighters here. You've got gear modifiers being reduced. You've got lanterns counting as an offhand weapon now for you. And you've got arming swords and falchions getting buffed. All made Slayer fighter just a tremendous force. It is a very strong character. And we should talk about PDR fighter for a second, right? The reason why Slayer fighter doesn't care about armor is that the playstyle you want for a build like this doesn't even want to use metal armor to begin with, right? Again, as a Slayer fighter, you might have wanted plate boots because of their innate strength bonus, and you might have wanted armament also for its innate strength bonus. But beyond those 2 items, a Slayer fighter would probably just always go for a padded tunic over a chest piece. And then they would also usually go for loose trousers or heavy leather legs over plate pants as well. So the metal armor that you're losing for being a Slayer fighter is not even that important. Whereas for PDR fighters, they play very differently, right? They stack physical damage reduction, and then they become an unkillable tank, and they try to murder you slowly. And they do usually have access to sprint, but even with sprint, you are very slow. You are a very, very slow man usually as a PDR fighter. So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling here basically. One important thing about PDR fighters is that in addition to reductions to damage, there's also a pretty significant reduction in what armor rating rolls you can get as modifiers. It used to be that an armor rating roll would be anywhere between, like, I think it was between 5 and 15, although it might have been even higher at the base. It might have been like 7 to 15 for certain equipment pieces. Now it's like between 1 and 10, which is a pretty significant reduction in your overall armor ratings on your PDR fighters. It is not impossible. It is now much harder to stack armor than it used to be. It's very hard to reach the PDR cap. Maybe even impossible. I don't know the exact numbers on it, but it's very difficult currently to reach the PDR cap. However, it is very easy, on the other hand, to get pretty decent armor because the base value of items was increased when it comes to armor ratings, right? Generally speaking, across the board. So the baseline for PDR fighter is higher. The higher end for PDR fighter is lower than it used to be. What that equates to is PDR fighters being very strong as well. One thing that is not taken into account is that fighters have access to crossbows. Very strong on Slayer fighter as an offhand, but also very strong on PDR fighter too. Rangers can't fucking kill a PDR fighter pretty much ever. It is the bane of your existence. I've had times where I've bear trapped a PDR fighter and have unloaded like 5 longbow shots into them, and they don't even give a shit. they don't give a fuck. They undo that bear trap and then they just walk at you in a line and you can't stop them. It's like the fucking Terminator, basically. It is very interesting. They also like barbarians, or like Slayer fighters, they murder barbarians. If you're a Felling Axe barbarian with Achilles strike, you can maybe damage trade with them and come out on top there. But it is tough. It is tough, because here's the thing too: the Slayer fighter or the PDR fighter not going to stand still for you to just hit him over and over in the head with a Felling Axe. They're going to be moving a lot, and they're going to be hitting you because it's also just their weapons are really easy to hit with. Arming swords, very easy to get headshots with. Same with Falchion, right? Felling Axe, very unwieldy. So I don't know. I think PDR fighter, arguably S tier, but I think I'll put it in A tier. But Slayer fighter right now, S tier character, very, very strong, very good. Very good guy. Ranger. I notably used to think, way back when, in the olden times, I thought Ranger was the best solo character. I do not currently think that. I do not currently think that Rangers are the best solo character right now. They're still very good. Bear traps are still an amazing tool. It's very strong. They still, in my opinion, kind of fuck up barbarians pretty bad too. Because usually, hopefully you're engaging them at a distance, right? And you can whittle them down on their approach to the point where you can choose if you've hit them enough. Oh, sorry. You can choose if you've hit a barbarian enough to engage in melee combat with them, or if you feel like that you have not gotten enough hits in, you can choose to disengage, right? And you can usually, not always, I guess necessarily, but you can usually outrun a barbarian, right? Which is a very strong thing to have as an option. Again, bear traps very good. They didn't suffer as much as someone like Rogue from the damage changes, but they've had many nerfs, specifically to longbow. They've had many nerfs over time with longbows. The fact that longbow doesn't triple shot anymore is a pretty big deal. That's a huge deal, honestly, when it comes to the balance. Also, longbows just barely do more damage than recurve bows now at this point. They've also reduced the amount of slow on longbows. I think overall, Rangers, maybe controversial. And maybe this is just me, I still think bear traps are just an insane tool that they have. I genuinely think that if Rangers didn't have a bow at all, they would be B tier because of bear traps. So I think because of their bows, I think I put them in A tier. Maybe this is controversial still. I think Rangers are actually pretty balanced right now. Generally speaking, I think they're in a pretty good spot currently. I think ideally, all characters would be in the A tier when it comes to their power levels, right? So I think Rangers are pretty good right now. I think Barbarians are pretty good right now, balance-wise. When it comes to which one is stronger, maybe Barbarians by like a hair, but not too much. Something like that. I don't know. What else about Rangers that I can talk about? Horrible melee weapons. I don't even like Spear anymore for Ranger, I feel like. I don't know. Something's, don't try not to melee fight if you can help it. Avoid melee at all costs with Ranger. But they're good. They're generally speaking pretty good still. And again, I just cannot emphasize enough how important bear traps are. Obviously there's counterplay to them, but here's the thing, nobody's constantly scanning the floor for bear traps. Sometimes you might spot one, but if you put one in the dark, they're doomed. They're so useful. Anyway, sorry. Up next is Rogue. Where does Rogue go right now? Rogues have been all over the place over the last 2 months, right? When I made my initial solo tier list, I had put Rogues in the A tier, and that was a mistake. Rogues were probably S tier back then, but since then, Rogues have been pretty heavily nerfed, right? They've had weak point attack significantly reduced. They've had their stealth duration, which in solos is actually a pretty big deal, how much it's been reduced. So that's not good. they've got a lot of problems, but there's been a recent change that has really helped rogues recently, and that is buffs to the rogue weapons. Rapier, short swords, and all daggers have had their damage pretty significantly increased. But again, rogues more than anyone have suffered the most probably from the gear modification changes, right? I mentioned before damage stacking. Rogues were the biggest, probably the number one character that really abused damage stacking, right? They did some crazy shit way back in the day, right? Ambush combined with back attack sometimes, combined with, plus 40 damage per hit, meant that you would very oftentimes sneak up on a barbarian and two-shot them, right? Which is obviously not okay. That is not a healthy place to be for the meta, and they're not there anymore. But they're okay. They're okay right now. Where do I put them? Well, let's look at their matchups, right? Rogues actually do a pretty good job against Slayer fighters. If the rogue gets the jump on a Slayer fighter, they can win that match. That's how you should evaluate, basically, right? Is when you get the jump on someone, can you kill them? And Slayer fighter, usually the answer is yes, but not always. Because they're pretty fragile. And if you ambush them, you can kill them in 3 hits right now, still pretty easily. So it depends on how fast they can react to getting attacked. But in a fair fight, no. In a fair fight, no, you will lose this. You have pretty good damage, but they have better damage output than you do. I'm sorry to say. It's just the truth of the matter. It's not going to go well for you. Barbarians. You have to do hit and run tactics with a barbarian right now. You can't really afford to trade long term because they'll rage, they'll throw axes at you, they'll eventually hit you with an Achilles strike, and you probably will die, right? So you can like attack once or twice and then just run away, and then come back and attack once or twice and then run away again. And you can do that for a pretty long time, and you probably usually win those exchanges. But I don't know. It's tough. If the barbarian gets a jump on you and they land that first Achilles strike, it's Jover. It's so fucking over for you. Ranger, rogues have the advantage there, generally speaking. It's usually pretty easy to sneak up on a ranger. The exception being is if they have good bear trap placement. So it's really ranger dependent. But as long as you can successfully approach a ranger, you will tear them to pieces pretty quickly. Cleric, same issue as the barbarian. You can attack, disengage. Holy strike is an issue for that strategy, right? If they holy strike you, it's an issue. But here's the problem: is that as soon as the cleric whips out the spell book, you just go in, and you'll kill them before they can kill you 9 times out of 10. I'm sure, usually pretty much, right? So I think they win most cleric fights, and if they're like a more armored cleric, again, you can just do hit and run tactics. And then bard they crush. Wizard and Warlock. Warlock's a little bit weird, but generally speaking, I think rogues beat Warlocks. I think rogues got to go in A tier still. I think rogue goes in A tier. It's definitely weaker than it used to be, but I think generally speaking, they do pretty well. When a PDR fighter, they usually lose. Here's the problem with PDR fighter. If you try to do hit and run tactics, they whip out the crossbow and they just fucking nail you. And if you try to just weave in and out of combat with them, you try to like dance in and out, they will whip out the crossbow and shoot you still, right? I depending on how geared they are, I imagine most fighters will outrace you just by shooting you with a crossbow point blank. Like it's not great. So I don't know. I think A tier is fine. I can be convinced B tier. Definitely not S tier anymore though. Rogues have fallen pretty far from their previous dominance. But this is where I put rogue right now, probably. Up next is Wizard. Wizard, kinda ass. I've been saying Wizard's ass for a long time. I think Wizard goes currently, I'm gonna say right now, in the bottom of B tier. They've had many damage damage nerfs throughout the months. It's been tragic for them. It's been rough being a wizard lately, right? In addition, they've had like their invisibility and their haste spells nerfed. Like what more do and then +1 all attributes rolls have also been nerfed. So what do wizards have anymore? I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. I think wizards are better than bards, but not by much. I think it's close. I can see an argument for wizards being in C tier, but every time I rank wizards low, everyone gets angry at me. But I'm so confident they're bad right now. I'm sorry. They got stanky shit right now. It's not good. And last up is warlocks. What the fuck do I do with warlocks, man? The good news for warlock is that they're no longer the worst character in the game. That still goes to bard right now for solos. I had a lot of people in the last tier list video tell me that I was sleeping on Blow of Corruption. And I was. Blow of Corruption was a much better ability than I realized. However, warlocks are still kind of bad. I'm sorry, they're still pretty bad. Especially after the magic healing nerfs they had. They just have a lot of issues. But, that being said, they're not hopeless. Spellless Warlock is interesting. Blow of Corruption and Phantomize are a pretty potent combo of abilities. And you have access to Longsword, so you can play like a weird mobile Longsword fighter. But that's kind of a meme, I feel like. I don't think it's a real build, really. If you want to play Longsword, just play fighter. Because you have access to sprint as fighter. And the Warlock spells. Here's the thing: power of sacrifice, the one that gives people the strength bonus but drains their health. That is a very powerful spell to put on your enemies. But when you miss it, you eat shit. You take so much self-inflicted damage whenever you miss that spell. That is a huge liability. And obviously you can just say get good, but it's not that simple. That is a huge flaw of the characters, that when they miss that spell, they put the debuff, or technically it's a buff, but they put it on themselves. That is a huge issue. Curse of Pain, pretty good. You know what? They did just recently get a buff to their laser beam. I haven't played with that enough yet to have a strong understanding of how strong that spell is. But the fact that the first day I saw that spell get buffed, I saw it, and then I never saw it again. I think the spell is probably still pretty bad. I'm sorry to say. They're just a weird character. I think Warlocks go above Wizard right now in strength, because I think they're still pretty good. Blow of Corruption is better than I gave them credit for. But, again, let's look at the matchups here, right? Who does Warlock beat? I think Warlocks usually beat Wizards. They beat Bards. Again, I think Rogues win usually, but it's pretty weird. Rangers beat the shit out of Warlocks usually. Unless you're the Blow of Corruption Phantomized Warlocks, then you can actually do a pretty good job of distance closing. You can close the gap pretty easily and then just get on top of them and kind of slice them to bits with Blow of Corruption. Not a terrible choice, but when you forego your spells, which are really important, I think. I have been told that a lot of clerics run the debuff reduction perk, and because of that, warlocks lose to clerics usually, right? Which makes sense to me. Because again, clerics kind of suffer from how many useful perks they have for solos. So I think a lot of them default to just using that one to fuck over warlocks, because they're actually pretty common. Not as common as like fighters and rogues probably, but still a pretty common class to see in goblin caves, right? So I think clerics beat warlocks usually. Rangers beat them, rogues beat them. I'm happy to say the barbarians usually beat warlocks in fights, because warlocks, like a lot of characters, slow as shit. It's a big issue that they have. Phantomize gives them a speed buff. If you take Phantomize, though, you lose the burst damage of Blow of Corruption. And if you don't take spells, you lose your spells, which are really important too. So I don't know. So I think Barbarians usually can chase down and kill a Warlock. They just out DPS the Blow of Corruption, basically. And you know, we haven't mentioned it before. I've been ignoring talking about this. Warlocks have some pretty weird weapon choices. I don't know if Warlocks would be better if they had Arming Sword. I think they would be, because their best one-handed option is Falchion, which is fine. But I think Blow of Corruption would be better on an Arming Sword. One thing you need to keep in mind is that Blow of Corruption fails to proc and goes away if you hit someone's shield. And Falchions are a little tricky to hit around shields, Whereas arming swords, because of the more vertical, or I guess it's more of a diagonal, but because of the initial swing, it's a lot easier to hit over someone's shield with an arming sword than it is a falchion. So I think arming sword would be a better option for warlocks to have. And it would also make Crystal Ball Warlock a little bit better too, if they had arming sword, because then they wouldn't have as much of a speed debuff. They're just so fucking slow though. Still, I don't know. I'm going all over the place. Warlocks go in the B tier still. They're cool. They have tools, but I think just generally speaking, they just lose too many of these matchups. One thing to mention, they have a really good matchup against PDR Fighter, which again is very strong, but is just not as common as Slayer Fighter. I think right now Slayer Fighter does kick their teeth in, generally speaking, but they're, you know, it's not a 100-0 matchup again. It's probably like 60-40 on that one, which is a big issue to have. But they trash PDR Fighter pretty significantly, right? They're so slow, they're so easy to hit with your debuffs. And then you can usually, if they're trying to deal with you via range damage, if you're having a range off with a PDR fighter, you can usually out heal their damage output, which is a very good thing. And then also, if they come into you to fight close quarters, Blow of Corruption shuts down their second wind, right? Which is also very important. So they have one very good matchup of the higher tiers, but they kind of lose to everyone else, except for again for Wizards and Bards as well. They kind of beat them too, which is interesting. And that's it. That's our tier list. That is the tier list for solos. Man, maybe this was actually pretty long. I'm gonna do actually 2 different videos. I think I've decided instead. We're gonna split this up into a second video for trios. I think that'll be fun. Anyway, sorry if I said we were doing both this video at the beginning. I don't remember what I said. That was an hour ago for me, right at this point. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you agreed, cool. If you disagree, you should leave a comment and say why you disagree. And please don't call me a moron. I would appreciate it if you were at least somewhat civil. And if you are, I will treat you with respect as well. Anyway, thanks for watching. Goodbye.